The collapse of Donald Trump's judicial infrastructure represents more than just the conclusion of a sequence of isolated litigations. It signals the terminal exhaustion of a political longevity strategy grounded in systemic institutional shielding. We are witnessing a historic milestone where the elasticity of constitutional norms and the doctrine of presidential immunity have reached their inevitable breaking point, forcing the system of checks and balances into an existential decision. The Supreme Court, by dismantling the final layers of protection that sustained executive exceptionalism, does not merely redefine the immediate future of a former president, but restores a power hierarchy that many believed was permanently subverted by political influence. What is observed now is the beginning of a deep institutional correction process, where the technical authority of the judiciary overrides the narrative of invincibility, evidencing that the democratic architecture of the United States possesses self-correcting mechanisms capable of acting when the concentration of authority threatens the integrity of Republican foundations. To understand the magnitude of this decline, it is imperative to look back over the decades during which the concept of executive immunity was shaped as a tool for governmental stability. Traditionally, the American legal system allowed for considerable maneuverability for White House occupants, under the premise that the fear of future lawsuits should not paralyze vital state decisions. However, what was once a functional safeguard transformed, in the last decade, into an aggressive defense strategy that sought to expand these privileges beyond the official term. This phenomenon created a legal grey area where the distinction between official acts and private interests became dangerously blurred. The current crisis did not emerge in a vacuum. It is the accumulated result of years of constant testing of the limits of authority, culminating in a scenario where the judiciary felt forced to draw a definitive line to protect the Republican order. The background of this systemic transformation reveals a transition from a phase of consolidation to an imminent breaking point. For years, the perception of Donald Trump's legal invincibility was sustained by successive procedural victories and strategic delays that undermined the celerity of justice. This attrition tactic served not only as a technical defense, but also as a political propaganda tool, reinforcing the idea that the system was incapable of reaching certain spheres of influence. However, this same strategy generated internal pressure within the institutions that now seek to reaffirm their historical relevance. The importance of this theme transcends the immediate moment, as it touches the essence of the social contract. When the last line of institutional defense gives way, the impact reverberates through all social layers, signaling that the era of legal exceptionalism is reaching its inevitable and turbulent definitive and irreversible closure. The United States Supreme Court now finds itself at the epicenter of an unprecedented authority crisis in modern history. For a long time, the composition of the court was seen as a safe haven for conservative theses and expanded executive protections. Nevertheless, the need to preserve the judiciary's legitimacy before history forced a strategic repositioning of the justices. By dismantling the thesis of absolute immunity, the court signals that its primary loyalty rests on the integrity of the constitutional text. If you value deep analyses of institutional power, subscribe now to follow the developments of this historic crisis. This movement is a response to the perception that the judiciary could be becoming an appendix of the executive branch, which would threaten the fundamental balance of democracy. The decision to remove the suspensive effect of crucial lawsuits is an act of institutional survival that redefines the limits of presidential authority. This scenario of legal vulnerability is part of a global trend of reviewing the limits of populist power against traditional governance structures. The American case serves as a laboratory for other Western democracies, watching how centuries-old institutions react to the stress caused by leaders who challenge established norms. The connection between the present and previous events such as Watergate or the integrity crises of the post-war period, evidences that the system is searching for a balance point between executive efficiency and accountability. The collapse of the financial and political support infrastructure around Trump is the practical consequence of this realignment. What is happening is not just an individual trial, but a stress test for the foundations of the Republic. The result will dictate whether judicial protection will continue to be a shield for powerful individuals or if it will return to being the safeguard of common justice. The central conflict paralyzing Washington's power structures today lies in the head-on clash between the doctrine of absolute immunity, vigorously defended by Trump's legal team, and the principle of institutional responsibility, which the Supreme Court desperately attempts to reaffirm. On one side, there is a deliberate attempt to convert the presidential office into a perpetual legal shield, capable of neutralizing both criminal and civil litigation even after the end of the term. On the other, the court faces the moral and technical imperative to demonstrate that executive authority is not a blank check, but a delegated function under strict constitutional limits. This dispute is not merely academic. It represents a battle for the soul of the legal system, where the interpretation of a single clause can decide whether the system of checks and balances still has teeth to bite or has become purely ornamental before history. The prevailing tension suggests that what is at stake is the very future viability of Donald Trump as the primary political actor of the conservative camp. The systematic collapse of his main legal thesis not only opens the doors for immediate criminal trials, but triggers total vulnerability on multiple fronts that were previously protected by a haze of interpretative uncertainties. When the protection of absolute immunity is removed, the former president ceases to be an institutional untouchable and becomes a common defendant, subject to the rigors of evidence and due process. This scenario reveals a critical transition where the force of political resistance finds its limit in the rigidity of procedural norms. The dispute, therefore, ceases to be about ideology and becomes about physical and financial survival, evidencing that the loss of the presidential mantle exposes the individual to a judicial reality that does not accept rhetoric as valid evidence. Beyond the individual dimension, the conflict signals a significant dispute over the definition of the limits of executive power for the 21st century. The current process is at a critical stage where the collapse of a single legal thesis acts as the trigger for the dismantling of an entire defense infrastructure built over years. The Supreme Court, by deciding not to extend the veil of immunity to unofficial acts, seeks to prevent the precedent from creating a de facto monarchy under the guise of democracy. However, this decision implies institutional risks, as the former president's support base interprets every technical move as deliberate political persecution. The conflict remains ongoing, fueled by the perception that the rules of the game are being rewritten in real time. This legal uncertainty fuels instability, turning every court session into a symbolic battlefield for the legitimacy of the state. The removal of judicial shielding by the Supreme Court operated like the extraction of a cornerstone in a complex architecture of delays and stalling maneuvers. For months, the defense team used every available procedural mechanism to stagnate the proceedings, relying on an expansive and almost monarchical interpretation of executive privilege. However, the moment the final verdict was delivered, the accumulated weight of multiple indictments ceased to be an abstract threat and became an immediate and inescapable reality. This decision did not just resolve a pending technical issue, it triggered an automated sequence of judicial reactivations across various levels. The strategy of using time as a strategic ally evaporated instantly, leaving the defense exposed to a schedule they no longer control or influence. This shift from a posture of waiting to a state of forced response marks the beginning of the end for the narrative of systemic invincibility. Following the Supreme Court's mandate, Judges in lower courts immediately began unblocking cases that had been stalled for over a year by stay orders. This reactivation was not merely bureaucratic, but deeply strategic, allowing for the scheduling of trial dates that collide directly with the most critical political and electoral calendar. In jurisdictions like New York, Florida, and Washington, D.C., the judicial apparatus regained its momentum, demanding discovery materials and witness testimony that had been previously protected by secrecy. This synchronous movement on multiple fronts created a pincer effect, exhausting the operational and financial resources of the defense team beyond their sustainable limits. Each decision from a lower court now carries the authority of the High Court's precedent, eliminating the possibility of new groundless delaying appeals, transforming the courtroom into an environment of documented facts and irrefutable evidence. The exposure of internal documents and sworn testimony represents the turning point where narrative control definitively migrates from the defendant to the prosecution. As evidence flows into the public record, the perception of inevitable responsibility grows among both the electorate and the class of major strategic donors. It is fundamental to understand that, in a system built on institutional transparency, silence ceases to be a viable option when the court demands grounded answers. If you value this strategic and deep analysis of institutional power, subscribe now to follow all the developments of this unprecedented historical crisis. This influx of verified information serves to erode the carefully constructed image of political persecution, replacing it with a chronological account of actions and consequences. The psychological impact of watching the legal fortress crumble in real time forces even the most loyal supporters to recognize the new factual reality. Financial considerations now emerge as a critical factor in the accelerated collapse of the political support infrastructure around Donald Trump. The astronomical costs of maintaining a high-level legal defense in 4 simultaneous criminal trials have begun to drain the reserves of political action committees. This financial hemorrhage creates a devastating ripple effect. As funds are diverted from campaign advertising and grassroots organizing to pay legal fees, the movement's operational capacity drastically decreases. Strategic donors, particularly those from the corporate and financial sectors, are historically risk-averse and tend to distance themselves from candidates who appear legally compromised. The realization that their investments might be financing a lost legal battle instead of a victorious electoral campaign has led to a significant cooling in material support. This fiscal squeeze acts as a secondary form of isolation, depriving the leadership of the necessary means to sustain influence. Politically, the loss of judicial protection has triggered a slow but steady exodus of strategic allies, who previously saw the former president as an untouchable and dominant political force. Senators and representatives, who once feared the electoral consequences of any dissent, are now recalculating their positions based on the real likelihood of a final criminal conviction. This internal fracture in the party is evidenced by subtle changes in official rhetoric and the emergence of alternative leadership voices seeking to distance the party from the legal quagmire. The perception of inevitability surrounding the candidate is being replaced by a sense of political liability, where association with a convicted figure could be fatal in a general election. This shift in the political wind is not accidental, but a direct consequence of the legal shield being pierced by the Supreme Court. As the institutional consensus moves, political isolation becomes an insurmountable barrier to public survival. The final consequence of this chain of events is the total isolation of the individual from the protection systems that previously defined and sustained his power. With the legal defense reduced to a desperate attempt at damage control, the capacity for strategic maneuver has been effectively neutralized on the power board. The transition from a role as a central influencer to that of a defendant fighting for his personal freedom represents a profound inversion of status in the American hierarchy. The infrastructure's collapse is now a self-sustaining process, where each legal setback feeds a narrative of terminal decline and loss of relevance. The inability to dictate the terms of engagement, whether in court or in the political arena, signals the definitive conclusion of the era of absolute dominance over institutions. The political machine, once powerful and feared, now resembles a hollow structure, struggling to maintain its utility in a system that has decided to move forward without looking back. The visible layer of this phenomenon suggests, at first glance, a staggering legal defeat that places Donald Trump in a state of unprecedented personal and political vulnerability in modern history. For the average observer, the central development is the imminent risk of ineligibility or even incarceration, a narrative that dominates global headlines and fuels polarized debates about the future of democracy. This superficial interpretation focuses on the spectacle of the trial and the fall of a political giant, treating the event as a direct sanction for specific acts. However, beneath this skin of journalistic event, what truly emerges is the crumbling of an illusion of impunity that was cultivated for decades. Public perception is captured by the immediate impact of the sentence, but this view ignores the deeper gears that sustain the Supreme Court's decision, reducing a complex systemic movement to a simple clash of individual wills. In a deeper analytical layer, the decision reveals a deliberate movement of self-preservation by the Supreme Court as the ultimate institution for interpreting the law. By sacrificing the thesis of absolute protection around Trump, the justices signal a strategic course correction to restore the judiciary's credibility, which had been eroded by perceptions of partisanship. It is a systemic effort to reaffirm the principle of checks and balances, demonstrating that the democratic architecture of the United States possesses immune defenses against the excessive concentration of executive authority. The strategic objective is not just to punish an individual, but to protect the court's long-term legitimacy before history. This maneuver implies that the legal system prioritizes its institutional survival over any political loyalty, evidencing that the preservation of the constitutional structure prevails over the maintenance of an ally who has become a liability for the stability of the state. In a macro-structural perspective, the decline of judicial safeguards around the presidential figure represents a systemic response to the pressure accumulated on the foundations of the republic. The system of checks and balances, operating as a living organism, identifies excess authority as an institutional pathology that threatens long-term equilibrium. This correction is not random, but follows a historical logic of the executive branch's ebb and flow after periods of uncontrolled expansion. By removing the legal shielding, the state reaffirms that the constitutional order is the sole guarantor of national stability, regardless of populist fluctuations. This movement signals to global actors and investors that legal predictability remains the central pillar of American hegemony, triggering a geopolitical realignment where trust in institutions is restored through the sacrifice of individuals who challenged the primacy of law over political will. At the micro level, this transition materializes in rigid timeframes, such as the issuance of mandates that force the immediate delivery of financial records and encrypted communications previously protected by privilege. The Supreme Court's specific decision not to intervene in the suspension of trial deadlines in federal courts creates a logistical bottleneck, where every defense motion is summarily rejected for lacking a solid constitutional basis. We observe the freezing of assets in corporate accounts and the strategic withdrawal of major donors at specific fundraising events, where the market value of Trump's political influence plummeted following the confirmation of hearing dates. These specific actions, from the sound of the gavel in a Manhattan courtroom to the official notification from the Department of Justice, are the concrete gears that grind down the thesis of invincibility, converting legal theories into financial consequences and fully enforceable restrictions on freedom. The implications of this judicial collapse extend to the nation's electoral heart, altering the strategic calculus of the Republican Party for the coming cycles. With the dissolution of the primary protection barrier, the party is forced into a precarious position between maintaining loyalty to a legally compromised figure or performing a pragmatic pivot toward more institutionally stable candidates. Strategic donors, who traditionally prioritize stability and legislative influence over ideological fervor, have already begun recalibrating their investments, diverting resources from a movement now perceived as a high-risk liability. This transition suggests a period of internal fragmentation, where the previously unified front shows cracks under the weight of judicial precedents. The electoral map is being rewritten, not just by voter sentiment, but by a structural shift in how political power is legitimized and financed by the traditional party system. In the social and cultural sphere, the erosion of safeguards deepens the fissures in the American collective psyche, creating diametrically opposed interpretations of the same legal reality. For the support base, the Supreme Court's decision is interpreted as a betrayal by institutional elites, a narrative that reinforces the sense of disorientation and fuels a reactive skepticism against the judiciary's independence. Conversely, for segments that prioritize systemic integrity, the movement is hailed as a necessary restoration of the rule of law and a vital check against executive excess. This intensified polarization risks turning courtroom victories into catalysts for civil unrest or prolonged institutional distrust. The resulting friction indicates that, although the legal system finds a technical resolution, the cultural wounds and the perception of politicized justice will persist as defining characteristics of the national landscape for the coming decades of public debate and narrative dispute. Geopolitically, the fragility of the former president's position recalibrates United States' prestige on the global stage, as allies and adversaries interpret these internal legal battles as indicators of national stability. A nation perceived to be in a state of internal legal warfare often sees its diplomatic leverage diminished, as international partners seek more predictable and institutionally secure interlocutors. Economicamente, markets sensitive to political volatility have already begun pricing in the potential for significant administrative changes and the possible legal dissolution of a large-scale business empire. The possibility of massive financial fines and the forced liquidation of assets could destabilize sectors of the real estate market where the brand was previously dominant. This correction movement signals to the global community that the American legal framework remains the final arbiter of power, reinforcing the dollar's role as a safe haven despite internal political turbulence and severe stress on fundamental democratic and republican institutions. A fundamental turning point occurred when the expectation of ideological loyalty by the appointed justices collided with the imperative need for the Supreme Court's institutional preservation. For years, Donald Trump's strategic defense operated under the premise that the court's conservative composition would function as an insurmountable barrier against criminal or civil proceedings. However, the contrast emerged clearly when the bench chose a strict interpretation of the Constitution, prioritizing the long-term stability of the judicial system over the protection of a single political actor. This shift in interpretative direction altered the balance of power, transforming what was seen as a safe haven into an environment of rigorous scrutiny. The tactical disappointment of the legal team revealed that the architecture of the American judicial power possesses a resilience that transcends individual affinities, marking the exact moment when the shielding strategy became obsolete. Another significant contrast manifests in the transition from the narrative of political persecution to the undeniable reality of documentary evidence presented in public forums. What was once protected by the veil of executive privilege became the primary fuel for the prosecution, generating a change in perception where secrecy gave way to forced transparency. This turning point dismantled the aura of invulnerability surrounding the business and political operations of the Trump family, revealing an internal structure much more fragile than public appearances suggested. The dissonance between the rhetoric of resistance and the succession of concrete procedural defeats created a vacuum of authority that can hardly be filled by new rhetorical maneuvers. When the reality of judicial facts overrides subjective interpretations, the landscape changes permanently, forcing everyone involved to deal with the consequences of decisions that now seem inevitable and devoid of any room for political negotiation or postponements. The synthesis of the events described reveals that the collapse of Donald Trump's judicial safeguard should not be interpreted as a fortuitous accident, but as the inevitable result of a constitutional system that triggers its defense mechanisms when tested beyond the breaking point. The trajectory that began with the search for an absolute immunity shield ends with the reaffirmation that delegated authority is subordinate to the rigidity of the Republic's fundamental text. What collapsed before the Supreme Court's scrutiny was the strategic illusion that political influence could, in a permanent and structural way, override the hierarchy of legal norms. This convergence of technical decisions and institutional needs demonstrates that the American democratic architecture prioritized its own longevity over individual protection, restoring a balance of power that defines the limits of future governance for all relevant actors. Looking toward the immediate future, the scenario signals a structural course correction where accountability returns as the central pillar of the exercise of executive power. The analytical projection indicates that the established precedent will prevent future office holders from using the state machine as a refuge against judicial scrutiny, closing an era of exceptionalism that threatened institutional stability. Although social tension and political polarization continue to pulse in the national fabric, the legal infrastructure emerged from this crisis with its authority reaffirmed and its borders clearly defined with unprecedented clarity. The broader understanding of this process allows for the perception that justice, though slow, preserves a capacity for self-correction that is vital for the survival of the social contract. The closing of this chapter does not only resolve a legal impasse, but projects a new phase of full, secure, and mandatory administrative responsibility within the Republican architecture.